houses, state senates. After the census is done every 10 years, state legislatures get to redraw election districts, both for themselves, like for state senate seats, state legislative districts, but also for congressional districts. And anybody with good voter data and free reign to redraw the maps can redraw the maps to basically guarantee whether the person who'll get elected from that district will be a Democrat or a Republican. So 2010, census year, was a key year to try to take control of state legislatures. Because if you could do that, you not only control policy in those states, which is a nice thing, you would also control how many Democrats and how many Republicans each of those states sent to Congress for a decade. And so the first genius moment was recognizing the opportunity here, right? I mean, first midterm elections after you get a new president, I mean, barring something really strange happening, those first midterms when you get a new president, they're always really good for the other party, for the party that doesn't control the White House. Republicans knew they were going to do well in 2010. Recognizing that, and recognizing that with the right strategy, they could turn that into a much bigger victory in the states that would basically guarantee that they would control Congress for a decade. That was a genius moment of recognizing the political leverage there. But then that was also transforming that genius idea into an actual plan to do it. So there's this little group that very few people have ever heard of, the Republican State Leadership Committee, and they go to work with this red map idea, and they raise money, nationally from deep-pocketed but fairly typical Republican donors. They raised a little over $30 million for this sort of quiet project. But instead of applying that money to the big, high-profile Senate races and congressional races and even the governor's races around the country, the kind of races that get all the attention and they get donors, partisan blood pumping, instead of those high-profile races that everybody was talking about, what they did at Red Map was political genius. Just as a pure political move, it was a visionary thing. Because they put that big money from big-ticket Republican donors who honestly really only had big national ambitions for what their money could do. They took that big national money and they spent it in the most unimaginably obscure races all over the country in very specific strategic ways. The operational genius of the plan was that at Red Map, they identified the states that gave their legislatures the most control over the redistricting process. So they found the places where they basically get the most bang for their buck if they were able to be successful in flipping those legislative chambers from Democratic to Republican. Within those specific states, they identified the specific down-ballot races that they could win if they tried. Little state rep seats and state senator seats that could be flipped from Democratic to Republican with just the right amount of well-timed cash infusions. And so they targeted those big-ticket dollars to these very, very small-ticket races. So, for example, they funneled $1.5 million into 4 state Senate seats in New York. They flipped 2 of the 4. Congratulations, you just won control of the New York State Senate for $1.5 million. They spent $1 million on Michigan House races. That was good enough to pick up 20 seats in the Michigan House. They funneled $1.5 million to the Alabama Republican Party. $1.5 million in total, which, when properly targeted, was enough spending to flip enough seats that both the state House and the state Senate flipped from Democratic to Republican control for the first time since the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Not bad for $1.5 million total for the whole state. I mean, on an average fundraising day right now, Jeb Bush literally raises that much money before lunchtime in one day. That was enough to get the whole state. One of the biggest coups for Red Map in 2010 was Wisconsin, where they thought it was worth the investment to try to topple the Senate Majority Leader. He was a Democrat named Russ Decker. Russ Decker was a fixture in Wisconsin. I mean, even in a red year, it did not seem like a guy like Russ Decker could lose. Then again, Russ Decker had never run in a race when a group like Red Map, for its own national strategic reasons, was going to come in and spend $500,000 on that race in the last 2 weeks before the election. And so, yeah, Russ Decker lost, and that seat became a Republican seat. I don't know if you know this, but I'm a liberal. And I think the Republican takeover in the states has been terrible, basically across the board in terms of policy consequences, because I don't tend to like Republican policies. I'm also a civics dork who thinks congressional districts shouldn't be drawn for partisan reasons to make safe seats for Democrats or safe seats for Republicans. Right? So on the merits, this whole story, as as a matter of the practice of politics, though, the strategic thought and planning and execution of a political plan to have the biggest and most long-standing impact without a huge outlay of resources and without your opponents ever cottoning to what you were doing until you had done it and they woke up the next morning to the realization that you had just screwed them not for one day or 1 year, but for a decade at least. When it comes to political genius, I hereby maintain